especially when we get into the climactic end of the game, I think this is all what it's building towards, is the culmination of these ideas, and then Takahashi and Sorosaga's, what they have to say about it.
Okay.
Given through this set of images and music and art that tries to get across their feelings on these principles to us, the audience.
Great.
That's what I think we're building up to. Of course, on top of that, what we already discussed as far as death and clinging on to life versus acceptance and all that stuff about life extension we talked about, all of those things together, I think, are what you could go into this. I'm not going to tell you what to do, but you could go into this playthrough of the game with us with those things in mind, and I feel like you might come out of it understanding the game in a very different light than maybe you have before. Unless you already knew all this coming into this, and this is just a fun recap of all the stuff you already know, in which case, congratulations.
Congrats.
This will be fun to talk about with you guys. Well, I have completed Xenosaga Ep.III at this point. I'm going back through it again, the Japanese version, because I've been told that there is some censorship, which seemed very obvious to me in certain scenes while I was playing the English version. So I'm going back through it again, taking notes, and the first one was just kind of a let's just play the game, you know, just enjoy the ride and feel it, and not try to like get so like bogged down in terminology and details, and then come back and do the note taking the second run through. But you, where are you at this point?
Somewhere around the lines. Well, I don't know what if I should say it because like we're not
we
there
haven't
yet.
talked about it yet.
But
yeah,
like
further than that,
some interesting stuff with Virgil. Should put it that way.
Okay, Virgil. Yeah, okay. So you're already into. They've already gotten back into the pocket to save the Elsa and all that stuff. Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, the thing is, I don't even know if we'll get this far because I think in order to really understand what they're going for with this story in terms of what their core theme they're driving at here, we're really going to have to dig a little bit more into Nietzsche than we have even in the previous two Xenosaga podcast breakdowns.
It seems like that's pretty essential at this point.
Yeah. So like, I'm talking about the subtitle for this chapter of Xenosaga, which is "Thus Spoke Zarathustra in English."
In English, also sprach Zarathustra.
Yes, also sprach. You know, this is a tangent about languages again, but in learning Portuguese and seeing all the Latin crossover between English and Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, right? It's also now extremely easy for me to say the Germanic.
That's a Germanic word.
Roots.
Because you don't. It's not in Portuguese, so it must be.
It's like,
since I've been learning Swedish, there's a huge similarities between Swedish and German. So
yeah, you get all those Germanic tribes that were all in the north spread around there, and how their language influenced also more of those northern regions, including Great Britain, where English comes from. But I was watching this meme the other day, this little baby talking to his dad or something like that.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Ah! Oh my God.
And just like
pretty good.
all these words, and I'm seeing the subtitles, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like those are all English.
Yeah.
How the fetch did I not know these languages were this close before?
Yeah,
anyway, so yeah, a lot of similarities in German and English. But we talked about will to power. We talked about Beyond Good and Evil, which were the previous subtitles of the previous games. And you know, we took a little bit of time dissecting those and trying to understand why those games were titled that way.
Yeah.
But this is one where I feel like viewers watching don't necessarily have to go read Thus Spoke Zarathustra, but I would recommend it.
I would too. I think, well, you know what's funny? Against Nietzsche's own wishes, I think everyone should read it. Nietzsche did not think everyone should read his book. In fact, it was very much
true.
clear Like, this is not for public consumption, specifically part 4.
Well, that's why it says it's a book for everyone and no one.
And no
right?
one, exactly, yeah. The meaning everyone should read it, but no one will possibly, would be his thinking. He was not a very successful author in his time. People around him knew he was smart, but he printed, I think, 40 copies of Thus Spake Zarathustra, and basically just gave it to friends. Like, he couldn't actually sell the book.
Yeah.
And that was that, right? So it's basically a book that no one's going to read, but that everyone should, except specifically, he said, this is not meant for public consumption.
You see this reflected right in almost the very beginning of the story, where Zarathustra goes and starts, like, sort of preaching, trying to give his wisdom to the people of the
and
town.
They reject him.
And they just mock and laugh at him.
Which is part of the thing. He says that's how it always is. That's how it has to be.
It's how it was for him.
That's how it was for him.
And so the result was he
the world.
became this elitist and
totally,
decided
totally.
that the idea is, well, most people are sheep and they're just not sophisticated enough
They just don't
to get it. And so, like, only elites like me.
Yeah.
That's a bit of a cynical view of him. I can understand the
but-
sentiment, and there is a real temptation sometimes, even in myself, to start thinking that way.
Oh, right.
But I really try to curtail myself from launching in that direction, because that's when I think the beginnings of justifying by whatever means necessary your own ideology, and you start to think, even no matter who is rejecting me or who is,
they just don't get it.
They just don't get it. They're not one of the elites like me. So I try really to reject that line of thinking in myself. That's just my own personal philosophy. Yeah. But I can see why he felt that way.
Right.
And certainly he was very, very, very brilliant person.
Oh, yeah.
And so that's another thing that makes it easy to...
Yeah. And he graduated from college at a super young age, and it was, like, obvious. He was at such a young age, he was invited into, like, the inner circle of, the people who would eventually go on to create the German state, right? It didn't exist at the time. But, people like Wagner and others, and the Grimm brothers. And
So anyway, well, I'm trying to think of where we should begin, because this really is integral to understand, I think, because so much of what this book is really driving at is, I think, what Takahashi and Xenosaga wanted to pay off in Xenosaga Ep.III in the whole, like, conclusive event, the whole climactic ending part. It's like it all kind of comes together there, both, again, with symbols. Like there are relics and, like, physical objects in the game named after things, but they're used as symbols for these particular principles, which the characters embody in that scene. We're talking about things like the will to power. We're talking about things like eternal recurrence. It is vital to understand what Nietzsche meant when he wrote about these things in order for us to understand what Xenosaga is trying to say. No, it's not. No, it's not. In fact, on those terms, I took a quote from Nietzsche to sort of explain my own feelings of inadequacy to even really try. Because I was coming into this today feeling like, dude, I just don't know if I'm ready to talk about this yet. And I had to sort of conclude, like, that's okay for now, because we still have several more episodes after this to elaborate on it. Right. I think all we have to do today is get the ball rolling and ask the right questions and get the viewers asking the right questions so that their playthrough is informed by those questions, and then they can be looking for those answers as they go. So here's a quote from Nietzsche real quick. "I've had to produce courage for myself since discouragement approached me from all sides, courage to bear the thought. For I am still far from able to speak and describe it. If it is true, or rather if it is believed to be true, then everything changes and turns around and all previous values are devalued."
Yes.
So I think maybe a good starting point for this discussion would be to say that one thing that Nietzsche's really exploring in Thus Spoke Zarathustra is this idea of a set of values of the past dying
Right.
and needing to be replaced by a new set of values. I guess what I'm getting at with this is in Nietzsche's time, I mean, you've got Darwin and you got the beginnings of, well, a lot of the West in Europe sort of like beginning to latch on or leave behind the Christian values that had sort of defined the culture for, you know, thousands of years at this point, 1,500 years at this point. He's seeing the beginnings of this, and it troubles him in the sense of a person being able to find purpose or meaning in their life.
Right.
That without this foundational cultural underpinning of the religion that sort of defined all of those things for the people, how are they now going to find that?
Yeah.
And so this book is written as sort of a way for him to address that question about how does a person find meaning and purpose in their life without God?
Without God.
So, Zarathustra, the real is based on an actual real figure.
Yeah, right? Zoroaster,
who was like a Persian prophet from the Middle East, who is sort of credited as like the first person to bring monotheism to the world.
The idea of Zoroaster being like the first monotheist is like kind of true, except he actually presented more of a dual framework.
Sure.
And the thing that he presented that Nietzsche hated so much was more just the battle between good and evil, right? That there was the good god, Ahura Mazda, and then there was the evil god.
That's
and I
true.
Can't remember his name, but whatever the evil god is. And then these two gods have this eternal struggle, and that you are meant to kind of, there's a dualistic kind of framework there.
Good point.
And that's more what Nietzsche was like, get beyond the good and evil, right? Which was, of course, the last game.
I think I might have mischaracterized that earlier, whereas I was putting him as like maybe the one who brought monotheism to the world.
That's part of it.
It's maybe not so much that as much as it is this first like really clear divide between good and evil. And then from there we get Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, which latched onto the monotheistic model of that concept.
Egypt and Greece, different other people kind of pitching in their ideas as well. But also I think this is why the Gnostic interpretation of Christianity is so appealing to Xenosaga and Takahashi, because it's like, well, that's kind of more of the Zoroastrian version of Christianity, right?
Yeah.
With this kind of dualistic framework and the escape up to the good and away from the evil.
The monad versus the
demiurge, which is like
the monad versus the
fallen
demiurge. That split between good and evil you're talking about. And so he very purposefully picked his fictional Zarathustra in this one to be the symbolic new figure who would like take this set of values that are now dead and bring forth a new one.
Yeah.
To replace that.
It's so funny because basically he's picking his Zarathustra to undo the work of the previous Zarathustra. Right? So, yeah.
I would say maybe undo is not the wrong word, but more or less it's already undone. It's already dead.
Oh, good point.
Right?
Just to recognize it and
dead
proclaim
already.
It. Interesting.
We need a new set. We need a new philosophy.
Yeah.
And I think that this concept of eternal recurrence, which we'll get into more here in a minute, it was sort of what he considered the foundation of something like that. Something that I don't think in his lifetime Nietzsche ever really got all the way through or thought through enough to where he sort of completed the philosophy.
Well, I think maybe he thought through it a little too much. He
lost it.
Well, if you know much about his personal life, the idea of experiencing his life again forever on loop, never being able to escape it, it would drive anyone mad. Yeah. Like, he did not have an easy life. He was very sickly. He was just rejected by every woman that he tried to approach. And he had all sorts of health problems. And of course, psychologically, he just broke at the end of his life.
Yeah.
Not even at the end, like kind of the middle of his life. And then he died young, I suppose.
Yeah. So anyway, this novel, because it's a fiction, it's a story that he wrote, just sort of like posit these sort of philosophical ideas that he was, playing with at the time. It all came to him very suddenly. It was interesting to read about sort of the genesis of this book. He's walking through the woods and he just sees this sort of giant stone out there.
Right. A pyramid-shaped stone.
Yeah. And just like, it just started coming. And it's described that he wrote at least the first volume, because it's released in 4 volumes over 2 years or something like that.
Yeah, a couple of years.
But he wrote it in like 10 days. It just flooded.
Which, if you don't know much about, if you haven't read Nietzsche, that sounds insane. Not least because of his sickly state. Often he was only ever able to write like 1 paragraph in a day, right? Like he spent so much of his time being sick and weak that whenever he sat down to write, he would just crank out a few sentences and it would just overwhelm him. He wouldn't be able to continue, right? And that was just kind of how he had to live his life for a long time. And the fact that person was able to crank out Thus Spake Zarathustra that quickly. And what he says is that it almost seemed as though the words for the book were being spoken to him. Like it didn't come from inside of himself in any way. He just read the world around him, and that's the words that it spoke.
Yeah. But what this book, I think, in order to really understand it, and I'm not even saying I do, which is why I was feeling unprepared to do this in the first place, and why I think we're going to be relying on people here with us live, chatting with us, but also people in the comments. And then
Mix is here, which is
continuing maybe to research a little bit more as we go through this.
I found a very simple way of kind of describing it, that the way that the game describes it versus the way that Nietzsche described it.
Okay.
And with the game, it seems to present us with this dichotomy of fate versus like free will, something like that.
Yes.
Right? Like the not good guys believe in this fate that cannot be changed. And then the good guys believe that mankind can define its own fate and that the future is not determined.
Which is every JRPG ever created. Exactly.
So it's really not that different. It's really not that different from a typical game. But connecting it with Thus Spake Zarathustra, you have something similar where, the religious idea of a god that controls fate is being overcome by the people who, have a will to power to create a different like path in what otherwise would have, been a single line.
Yeah.
And the way that this game is doing it, the way that it's divided up good versus bad, seems to be along those lines. That's, I think, a decent way to simplify it.
I got a lot of quotes. A lot of quotes. And like each one, I feel like we'll be able to break down and discuss as we go along, but they're not necessarily in like a great sort of sequential order, so it's a little bit messy here. Well, I think we could start with Heraclitus, who is a philosopher that Nietzsche really liked.
Yeah.
I think he was very inspired and influenced by him. Maybe a similar type of personality. Heraclitus was sort of described as being kind of a depressed...
tortured soul, kind of.
Tortured soul, as Nietzsche was in I think they called him the weeping philosopher or something like that.
Yeah. I like Heraclitus.
Heraclitus wrote, "No man steps into the same stream twice.
Yes.
For both the stream is different and the man himself."
And the man is different. Yeah, and that's the flow. Everything's in constant flow, and you can't solidify it into, well, as what Alan Watts would call the bits.
Yes.
That it is this ever-flowing, existence that, you're always changing. You are never the same person that you were even a minute ago.
Yeah.
So you can never, like lightning can't hit the same place twice.
Yeah.
It's the same kind of idea. Like, well, the river has flowed down. The part of the river you stepped in is like, a mile downstream now.
Yeah. One thing as far as Nietzsche's philosophy that I feel like I do latch on to a little bit, or at least I do agree with a lot, was he contended with, of course, Christianity in the West where he lived, but also even with, some Eastern philosophy.
Yes, and science itself, too.
With this idea of striving for something beyond what we are here and now.
Right, yeah.
Whether that is the Christian heaven.
Right. Or Nirvana.
Or some state
Yeah.
that we're trying to like escape out of this prison of life
Right.
and get to some sort of like peaceful, blissful place.
Yeah.
He sort of rejected this entire idea
Right.
because it goes against his idea of what growth is. Growth stems from hurdles and obstacles and
Right.
pain and suffering. If you're not encountering that conflict in your life and in your existence, then there is no growth. Growth
Right.
cannot happen without it.
Because the typical ideas of Christian heaven or a Buddhist nirvana is something along the lines of no conflict, like getting
Yeah.
rid of all conflict.
Right.
And Nietzsche's saying that that's, well, he would say that's a sign of weakness.
Yes.
You can't deal with conflict, you're weak.
Yes. And so this is where I think a lot of people, including possibly even leaders who have taken maybe some of Nietzsche's philosophy and misused it or misunderstood it in the way that they applied it to oppress.
Which is rampant. Yeah.
It was never meant to be this idea that the will to power is to go out and dominate nature and people around you
Right.
and just assert your will onto everyone. That is not what the will to power is. It's not what he ever meant it to be understood as. The will to power is this idea of, despite the fact that life is full of hurdles and obstacles and challenges and conflicts and suffering, that you have the will to plunge through that and grow, to continue in your ambition, in the fire that is inside of you, to reach further, to become a master, to continue growing, to continue extending, to continue asserting, affirming, expressing yourself
Right.
through all of that.
Okay. Now, I might actually say it might actually be a bit of both in that one, because Nietzsche is funny because he said that he doesn't hold any philosophy that anyone else holds, because if anyone else held it, then it wouldn't be worth defending in his mind. he was a, what would you call it? What's the word? What's a person who gives a negative, a contrarian? There you go.
Sure.
He was basically just a hard contrarian.
contrarian
And
guy.
that definition of will to power is good. I like it. I mean, but it applies to everybody. Anybody who, like Camus said, anybody who isn't dying has the will to power then, right? But I also think there's a different sense in which, like, some people really got it and others don't, despite the fact that they are still living despite all the hurdles of their life. Does that make sense?
Let me read a quote
Okay.
that is the reason why I see it this way.
Okay.
Nietzsche says, the creator seeks companions, not corpses.
Oh, yes. This
not
is true.
herds or believers either.
I remember
The
this.
creator seeks fellow creators.
I agree, but there are only certain people who can be those fellow creators, and that's the way that I remember.
And that's true.
Yeah.
And then this is exactly
Despite
why
everyone going through hurdles and making it through, and let's power through, and everyone dying when they're old instead of just killing themselves when they're young. It's more like, but there are certain people who really rise to the occasion, and those are the creators of culture, the creators of everything, the people who that's kind of the way I read it.
And I don't think yes, this is correct, and this is why in the first part of the Zarathustra story, when Zarathustra, so in the story, he's living in the mountains for like several years by himself, and he's like gained all this wisdom, he's done all of this self-reflection, he's like, now his cup overfloweth, and he wants to go back and give some of his wisdom to people.
After like 10 years,
Yeah, and he's lived up there alone with like his serpent and his eagle or something like that as his animal companions. So like he's going back down into civilization again.
Yeah.
He comes across this man in the forest who believes in God.
Right.
And warns him, because he tells him what he's going to do. I'm going to go down and take all this great wisdom to people. And like, it's time to rejoin humanity or society again. And he's like, well, just be careful. Like, these people are going to laugh at you. They're not going to like what you have to say.
Yeah. Sort
Sort of like foreshadowing what exactly is going to lead into your point here. And he's like, well, okay, whatever. So, and then the funny part was that this person believed in God, and Zarathustra thinks to himself, Could it be that this like man doesn't know that God is dead?
Yes, I love that.
Right?
The question, could it be? This man does not know. And that's almost the secret knowledge thing with Nietzsche, where it's like, I've got the knowledge and, they just don't know. They just don't know yet. That's all. They don't get it.
So he gets down into the town and they're all gathering around for a tightrope performer. Someone's going to walk a tightrope. And he kind of steps up and starts like preaching to them. And so they think he's part of the act at first, which is why they're like listening to him at all in the first place. So he starts explaining all of his philosophy and they're mocking him and laughing at him. And they're like, just like, get up on the freaking rope already. Like, enough talk. Like, we just want to see you walk, because they think he's the one. So the real guy gets up there. Some clown ends up interfering. The guy falls to his death. I won't get into the nitty gritty, but from this experience, Zarathustra takes away, okay, speaking to the masses is not going to be the way of going about this. There are only certain kinds of people.
Yes, exactly.
Certain kinds of people who are ready or who have the will to power within themselves to hear this wisdom. And so I will only preach now to certain disciples instead. So I think, long-winded way of getting around to the point here, it's not so much that I feel like Nietzsche felt like people, that there were only certain people for any other reason than they just wouldn't listen.
Oh, sure. Anyone could be that.
Anybody could be, but they wouldn't be because
fair enough.
They're lazy or they're what he deemed last man.
Oh, yes.
Right?
And that's the way I understand last man, is that 99% of men are last man.
Yes.
And then maybe less than 1% is the actual...
The potential for
the real people he cares about. Yeah.
The overman or ubermensch.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So basically, I think the easiest way to like give people the idea of what the last man is if you've seen the movie WALL-E.
Oh gosh, yes. Absolutely.
That is the people in WALL-E in the little ark vessel, the fat people that are just like they
red is the new blue.
Yes.
Boop, and then they're blue now and like, oh, it's so cool.
They're
all drinking their
is exactly what Nietzsche described as the last man.
100%.
The last
totally
man,
dependent. Yeah.
Yes. The last man in Nietzsche's the way he describes it are people so reliant on technology and who think that the ends of progress in technology is for the pleasure of people and to eliminate conflict and suffering as much as possible, which was totally against
pleasure and hedonism, something like that.
Yeah. Hedonism is essentially what he saw as the result of advancing technology and making people's lives easier and easier and easier.
Yeah.
Like the further that went, he essentially foresaw WALL-E.
Because he took Darwin. He took Darwin pretty seriously when Darwin wrote the stuff, and Nietzsche was like, oh, survival of the fittest, but what happens when there's no more natural selection? Because infant mortality rate is like 0.01%. Basically, everybody gets to live until they're old now. Not everybody, most people. That ruins the whole evolution process. And then things like monogamy and all the things that have been instituted to make sure that everything can be level for most people are things that are basically just contributing to the degradation of all of humanity into something that is no longer, there's no more pressure for them to become great. In fact, the lack of pressure is making them become less than great.
Right. And so he despised that idea. He really fought against that, and he really believed that in order for the Ubermensch, the overman, this sort of ideal human being to come about, you have to reject those pleasures, that ease and that comfort.
Yeah, find a way to reapply that pressure that is basically negated through technology.
Yes, accept that. Yeah. Seek for it, because that's where real growth, true evolution, and the next step for an evolving mankind is at. He also uses the analogy here with the tightrope Because Zarathustra keeps trying
I
to
was going
like
to say
preach
there's
to
a
them.
deep allegory there. Yeah.
He keeps trying to preach to them while the guy's tightroping. He keeps trying to like talk to them about his philosophy and convince them. And he says that the tightrope represents humans as a bridge in between the animal or the ape and then the
what they could
Ubermensch
be
at the end.
Yeah. And humans are the bridge,
Again,
not the end.
There's sort of this like dichotomy here between being and becoming.
Oh, yeah.
And Nietzsche was all about embodying becoming.
Yeah.
We're never going to be. None of us are going to be the Ubermensch.
Right.
We are the bridge for someone to walk over us. We live our lives in a way, in our will to power, in our struggle, right? That keeps people after us walking on us as a bridge to get towards that ideal. But the ideal is never reached because, again, if you've reached the ideal, there's nothing more to struggle against. There's nothing, you've reached the end. There is no end.
Which would be there is no end, yeah. Which would mean Ubermensch is an ideal that's unattainable, or even the idea, because if your definition of God is something like the infinite, well, the asymptote will mean that you never actually touch it, right? You're always going to be part of the bridge, part of the process of becoming. But, what would you say? But that process is a noble process, right?
Right.
And there you go.
Because it's the process,
it's in the pursuit of
becoming
yeah.
that's important, not in the being.
Right.
The being represents an end. The being represents a stop, an ending to growth.
Yeah, once you get rid of all conflict, that's heaven. And we're talking about Nietzsche kind of saying, no, that's not the point. That's not where we're trying to go here.
Right.
But a lot of people don't understand that.
No. And that is the part of Nietzsche's philosophy, all of Nietzsche's philosophy. Like the one thing I can really latch onto and go like, that's something I feel like I agree with. I feel like there needs to be some level of conflict. And by conflict, there's all kinds of things that constitute conflict.
Right.
I'm not talking about wars and violence. I experience conflict in every day of my life and has nothing to do with violence. Problem solving at work.
No, totally.
Or, oh, geez, the AC went out at my house. That sucks. I have to freaking sleep in 88-degree Fahrenheit weather for 4 days. And I'm like struggling against that. And like, that's a struggle. That's a conflict. That's life throwing challenges at you, even if they're small, but they pile up on each other and you navigate through them and you try to, you learn stuff from it, right? Like I come out of that and I've learned a lot more about the way AC works and the fact you're supposed to change those filters a lot sooner than I thought you were. Like, you learn, you grow, you gain knowledge through conflicts of that kind. Without them, you stagnate. That's the idea. And that's the whole center of the point of will to power. Will to power is all about, I'm going to keep busting through those challenges as they come at me, no matter how beaten up I am, no matter how worn out I am. I have this fire in me that is strong enough to say, freaking no, I am not going to get beat by you. I'm going to keep going and I'm going to overcome no matter what. That's what the will to power really is. So.
I like it.
That is necessary for a person to develop in order to accept that. I don't want to call it doctrine. He would not want me to call it that, but I'm going to call it that anyways. The doctrine of eternal recurrence.
Gotcha.
Which is, to put it simply, that Nietzsche believed that time was infinite, but that matter was finite. And as a result of that, as a natural result of that, life would repeat itself over and over and over in exactly the same way. So your life will be lived again by you in exactly the same way with no difference whatsoever, a fate, as you described it, over and over and over
and the same time,
without end.
Same thing,
So this is
referenced in the game.
Yes, this is going to be a huge part of the game, which is why I wanted to talk about this before we started. Will to power, which we've already talked about a lot, but which I think we've hopefully now clarified even more. But on top of that, this idea of eternal recurrence are like very, very important to understand in order to really get, I think, what they're going for with the game story. Right. But we go back to the Heraclides river or stream example, right? This is sort of a play on that, where it's like, if you're looking at it up close, if you're looking at time up close, it appears as if the river is never the same and the person is never the same.
That there's a flow, yeah.
But you zoom out from that little point in time and you actually see a ring in which it goes and flows into itself and repeats itself for eternity.
Yeah.
That this is the only thing that makes sense in an eternal timeline with finite matter. It's the only thing that makes any sense.
Yeah,
this
the matter
thing
has to be reused.
Be reset and play over and over and over again.
Because one of the ideas with infinite time, like one of the concepts, one of the reasons why a lot of maybe more materially minded people will say that, maybe talk about like the existence of life or things, saying that you don't need God in order for the universe to exist or in order for life to emerge, is because they can say, well, given infinite time, things will eventually happen, right? It's not just that, you put a bunch of matter and leave it alone and then, you somehow get like this incredible, whatever we have, whatever world we live in now, out of that. It's like, no, but if you apply time to it at the scale of, whatever it is, after 15 billion years, like it would do something, right? Something would happen. And the thing is, there's infinite time. So if this matter is capable of doing anything, it will eventually do everything, but because there's infinite time. So time just goes on forever.
Yeah.
But the fact that there's finite matter means that things will keep happening for infinity forever and never stop forever. There is no end to the time, which means there's no end to what the matter can do, that it will always be recycled into this flow that is just constant.
Right. So he was very troubled by this idea, and for reasons that I think you alluded to a little earlier. His life was not pleasant.
No, it wasn't.
And so the idea
this might be
of reliving his life over and over and over again seemed, and I think it might seem to a lot of people, especially those who've gone through a lot of hard things, like anything but that. Anything but that. A lot of people think of maybe reincarnation or even of, let's say, like the way the Matrix plays with this idea, right? There were still slight variations on the repeats or the resets.
Right, that's
so
true.
Like when Neo gets into the room.
Because intelligence was involved.
Right.
That's the whole point.
Right.
Nietzsche has done away with the idea of a super intelligence, of a god.
Of an
and so
architect.
Without anything like that, then the things themselves the system will just keep repeating forever because there's no intelligence to exert a force on it that would change it in any way. Right. An outside force.
I think that people would be open or maybe more open to this idea in general if there was if you allow for the idea or room for people to make slight changes or to learn or to do it a little differently next time. The idea that there's still a growth, there's still a change happening and not just a complete repeat that you can do nothing about. And it's a strict fate.
I feel like that is the idea of the Übermensch, is that there's a way to break it. Like he sees the cycle, it freaks him out, but what if we could break it and why not try?
I actually think for Nietzsche, I think that might be the way like this game
that's what I'm talking
interprets
about.
it.
The game is straight up doing that. You got to break the wheel, break the circle.
Yes, and a lot of Japanese media, particularly video games in this genre, basically resolve on that idea.
Right.
No, with a strong enough will, I will break that wheel and create a new future.
Right.
This is something that, for whatever reason, has come out of that culture as something that they latch onto and repeat in their stories over and over and over again, which is true in every culture. Every culture has certain things that are important that they latch onto in their culture and they repeat in their stories. This happens to be one for this genre that we see a lot. So, but I think for Nietzsche, at least where he landed, and his mind changed over the course of his life, was the idea
especially
of
after he read
accepting
Dostoevsky.
This. Because earlier, I mean, when this idea started coming to him, we talked about that large stone, right, that he saw.
Yeah.
And I think he writes about this in The Gay Science as well. It's like a demon that sits on the chest and is like revealing this idea or something to him, right? And it feels like a weight on his chest or on his soul almost. This idea of eternal recurrence is like a damnation. It's like it's a horrible thought.
It's a burden.
And I think most people would probably feel the same way, unless, I don't know, unless their life, they feel, well, there's some people that, I hate generalizing this way, so I'm really trying not to, because there are some people who say have a lot in terms of materially in life, but aren't happy at all.
Right.
So I'm not trying to say it's like, well, if you're rich and like you just live a life full of awesome trips and pleasures, that's not necessarily going to give you a fulfilled life that you would want to repeat over and over. There are a lot of people who live these lavish lifestyles that commit suicide and hate life. And vice versa. There's some people who go through some really, really hard things in life, but they've sort of found a way to frame it in a way to where there's a lot of joy and happiness.
So meaningful,
it really has nothing to do with that. And it has everything to do with the way you frame or the way that you choose to look at it. But some people, this idea that reliving their life over and over again, if there's a lot of joy and the joy sort of outweighs the suffering, at least in their framing of it, then maybe that sounds like it wouldn't be such a bad thing. But I think maybe intuitively for a lot of people, the reason that sounds so bad is because it almost, it's like people who want to live forever or people who don't want life to end or who want to their life extended, kind of like we've talked about here in previous episodes. What they're really looking for, I feel like, is meaning or purpose, and to not lose that meaning. But in this idea of eternity, it almost feels meaningless because there is no growth in it. It's just a repeat.
Stagnation.
And you don't remember what happened last time you lived it. You just go and do the same thing again. So you're not drawing upon what you did last time and growing from that. It's literally just repeating forever the same exact thing. So and that seems horrible.
That sounds like a stagnant universe, which also sounds like a dead universe. Like that's one of our, we've kind of played with this a little bit. One of our definitions of death is something that can't, like you talk about the Ouroboros eating its own tail, right?
Yes.
The cycle that can never be broken out of, or once you build the walls around your city, right? Once you're no longer being rejuvenated by the things from outside, right? And you're no longer letting the things inside out, and you're no longer bringing in new things from outside in, then it's basically just like a little death. Like it's a form of death. And what Nietzsche is describing with eternal recurrence is essentially a dead universe, a universe that is already. So it's interesting that not only can he posit the death of God, he also reasons himself to the death of the entire universe that he is currently existing in.
Yes.
Like it's he lives in a dead universe. That's a rough one.
And
that's almost rougher than the death of
God. And it takes
That's
someone
crazy.
with an incredible will to power to accept that and find meaning in it and to love it.
Well, Sisyphus,
ultimately.
This is Camus' idea with Sisyphus of he is condemned to roll the rock up the hill forever, right? Yet Camus is saying that, that if it can be found to be meaningful, then one must imagine Sisyphus happy.
Right.
So, like, that's essentially the same idea, that the cycle, if you can make it meaningful, if you can find it, or in the way some people interpret Nietzsche, to create your own meaning in the suffering, then, it becomes bearable, right? And then that's a life worth living over and over.
Right. So let me pull up some more quotes here. So let me get through these first. Man is something that shall be overcome. Man is a rope tied between beast and overman, a rope over an abyss. What is great in man is that he is a bridge and not an end. So we kind of touched on that.
That was good.
I tell you, one must still have chaos in one to give birth to a dancing star. I tell you, you still have chaos in you.
This I think is with the infant, the infant process of Zarathustra, right?
Yes, we're going to get into that too.
Okay, good. Because there's like different stages.
There's like the hero's journey of the Übermensch, which is like a 3-step metamorphosis. Yeah.
But the idea of a child just being full of chaos is something along the lines of the potential with which a new world can be made.
Yeah. Then here we got 3 metamorphoses of the spirit have I designated to you. How the spirit became a camel, the camel a lion, and the lion at last a child. So this is what you were just touching on.
I said infant, but yeah.
So what he's referring to with this is that in the first stage of a person's life, you have the camel stage, which is you're bearing the burdens of others.
Yes.
You're essentially being used as a beast of burden. Maybe a good maybe adjacent concept to this is that of apprenticeship, right? You're just listening and just like doing whatever the master tells you to do in your first steps of learning a craft. There comes a certain point where you've learned enough about that to where you want to say no to somebody finally. And you kind of want to start forging your own path.
Right.
That will to power is awakening inside of you and saying, I'm not just going to be that beast of burden for you anymore. I'm going to forge my own way and make my own legend and do my own thing. This is where you transform into the lion. Now, the danger of the lion stage is that you know enough and have enough pride to where you can start forging that own path, but you can also fall into the trap of hedonism.
Yeah.
And this stage can
rationalism.
Yeah, can fall really quickly into becoming the last man.
Yeah.
Rather than leading into the last metamorphosis, which is the child state, which is where sort of like all of your creativity can just be expressed and explored. And this is really, really important. This is something I hadn't really thought of before with Nietzsche. And so when I was doing a lot of my research for this leading up to this episode, this was one thing that was brought up that I felt like I didn't have quite enough time to really feel like I fully
why the
understood
infant
it.
is the top.
But I'm still looking into that, and there's some open possibilities here that I really like that are giving me sort of a new appreciation for Nietzsche.
Okay.
Because, I think a lot of people overstate his death of God aspects to his philosophy, and that he was sort of nihilistic and preached that there's no meaning to anything. That was not at all what he was about.
Right. Yeah.
He was all about finding that meaning and purpose.
He was a post.
He was against what was it? Schopenhauer,
Arthur.
Yeah. Who was a little bit more like that. He was a little bit more cynical, I think.
Yeah, and kind of resigned.
And so,
to the fate.
He's
like, well, I'm a camel. I'll just be a camel forever.
Yes.
Oh, doesn't it suck? But what can you do?
Right.
And Nietzsche's like, well, you could.
Nietzsche's will to power was almost a direct response to that sentiment.
Yeah.
And so, no, he's like, no, God is dead. We killed him or whatever, right? Like we've moved past this set of values, but now we need to create a new one to replace it, to give us purpose again. It's like vitally important that we do that.
He said, if we don't, and he described the next 200 years, so from his time point, from the time he said that till 200 years, which is maybe in 50 more years from now, that the next 200 years from his time would be a time of kind of discovering that and would be a tremendously tumultuous time full of war and death as competing new versions of values, new sets of values begin to clash.
Yes.
And he was saying this would go on for 200 years. So we still got 50 more years of this.
Yes.
Sorry about that.
But I'm actually, it's so interesting to look at the conflicts of our time and sort of see some level of prophecy in that.
Oh, absolutely.
Like
Nietzsche.
What is happening now in our culture, which is becoming more and more unified across the world, is all of a sudden we're clashing with differing values all the time.
Yep.
Like every day we're coming across people who have this different set of values that clash with ours and that challenge ours and that make us feel attacked.
Yeah.
And this is something we've talked about a lot with the internet and some of the problems of social media
we have
in previous episodes. And this is exactly what's happening. There's going to be in this conflict, this multitude of conflicts happening all over the world and to different scales, essentially certain pillars, hopefully, that will emerge as sort of the new foundation of moral values that will root humanity down again. Not that it was ever globally that way, obviously, but cultures were much more separate from each other than they are now. So it's the fact that we are globally connected in such a crazy degree at this point that is sort of, I think, hastening this process. And so hopefully the result of that will be that we'll land on it, not necessarily one thing. That's not what I'm trying to say.
Good.
But with maybe I'm trying to not say something incredibly stupid here. I'm trying to go all the way through the thought before I say it.
When you talk about Nietzsche, it's
hopefully we will become a little bit more rooted and not quite so chaotic. And there will be a new set of values that are at least compatible with each other to carry us again for another maybe couple thousand years until this one dies and then a new set takes its place, and then the new Ubermensch needs to like be sought out.
The new bridge.
Does that make
needs
sense?
To keep bridging. Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like I kind of see that, but I'm getting a little bit away from what I was trying to say there at the beginning, which was his replacement for God is art and creation.
Yeah, that's
and
right. Yeah.
A human being going within themselves, looking in here instead of out there for meaning. And out there, I'm talking about the heavens. I'm talking about the supernatural. I mean, we've killed those things, according to him, right?
Right.
So we're now looking here at the person, and we are affirming ourselves through our will to power, through art in a lot of ways, which is what he did too.
Yeah, that's
to essentially find that meaning, to find that purpose.
You know, Nietzsche was actually, he was something of an artist himself before he became an author. When he was growing up as like a teenager, he was a musician and a poet. And that's what drew him towards, I think, Wagner in general. And, you know, I don't know, he has an affinity for art, even though he kind of lost the ability to really express himself in art other than poetry, I would say still. But he didn't really go that way. He decided to go, you know, in this other way. But he was actually quite the good artist. I would love to. I wonder. I would love to like discover some music that he created or something like that. Yeah. But Mix has actually, this is several times that he has offered this gentle correction. I keep using the word find, like to find meaning or to find your own meaning, right? And he says it's not find, it's create. And that's why I think the infant or the child stage is so important. You're not just finding something that already exists, like an archaeologist or something. You are literally creating from chaos. You are creating meaning that did not exist before.
Yes,
and that's I take the gentle rebuke from this.
And I think that's why art is really the answer in Nietzsche's worldview.
Yeah,
for the replacement of God.
It's good, except not everyone's an artist, you know? In fact, most people aren't.
Well, I think that would depend on whether that is molded. Because if you look at children, they're
very creative.
Very creative. Yeah. So of course, some more so than others. But I feel like when you're a child, you're almost at your most just raw creatively.
Yes.
There's no rules.
Yeah.
You're just sort of playing and just whatever goes, and you can just come up with anything.
Yes.
And it's not until you're getting older and like the rules are enforced on you and you start to understand that there are confines and restrictions that even in the act of creating, maybe like writing a novel, you start bogging yourself down with, well, I can't do that because of this rule of how the universe works or whatever. But when you're in that total raw infant stage, like none of that matters. You can do anything, right? This raw creativity.
Yeah.
And I think that is the way of, again, the will to power is to affirm your life, to affirm yourself, to express yourself.
Right. And art is,
And art is the ultimate way of doing that.
Totally. Almost. It's the ultimate way of connecting yourself with other people in a meaningful way that can't just be easily put into rational words or just logical like thought.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. How do I express what I'm feeling because I've got all these thoughts and all these emotions and all this struggle and all this stuff I'm going through, right? And I could just sit down and like try to explain it to you. But we've talked a million times about the inefficiency of language to really like get that across.
Yeah.
How can I combine images, music in this way that will evoke that feeling even better than I could explain it to you?
Right. And sometimes 1,000 times better.
Yeah.
Than you could ever explain it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so like that's the kind of raw artistic creativity I'm talking about. And I think that is Nietzsche's answer for, and I'm not even sure he completed his answer. I think all the way up until he sort of, was mentally declining and then into his death, which was pretty early in life. Yeah. He was still developing this and still sort of evolving it. But we got some of what I think were the foundations. The foundation is built on eternal recurrence. That idea is kind of scary. We need people like the Ubermensch to have a strong enough will to push through that thing that seems insurmountable as a thing to accept and assert themselves and say, no, this is who I am. I'm the ultimate creator, not in the supernatural God sense, but in the artistic sense, who is going to leave who I am here in this time that I live and inspire and like make it mean something. Right. I don't know if that's like a perfect way to describe that.
I really, you know what? This is funny because you told me, like, as we were coming up here, I don't have notes prepared for Thus Spake Zarathustra itself.
Yeah.
You are demonstrating quite a good grasp of Nietzsche, I would say, and that book in particular. And I think you're doing a great job. I think you're doing better than I would.
It was
if I just had to explain it.
I don't know.
I think you're doing great. I think you're doing great.
But the book is really great.
Yeah.
And we haven't really even talked about the book that much. Like, there's that first part, he goes down in the tightrope and he's like, oh, I need disciples. He goes and has a bunch of discourses to his disciples. Yeah. Then he goes away for a long time and goes back into the wilderness again. That's for Nietzsche always where you're getting the enlightenment. It's not in the society.
It's like
you got to go be a hermit out in nature.
Well, that's where the prophets
nature is where you find it.
Yeah.
Anyways, and then he comes back and he keeps having this prompting that he needs to teach eternal recurrence, but he keeps not wanting to do that. Something's holding him back. And then he gets confronted by gravity itself, which is sort of embodied in this dwarf character who sort of like convinces him to tell him what eternal recurrence is. And he explains that. Anyway, the book is great. Everyone should look at it, but I think that's enough on Thus Spoke Zarathustra to get the baseline ideas of what I think is important to understand going into Xenosaga Ep.III.
Yeah, I think we hit on the main points.
Because this is, especially when we get into the climactic end of the game, I think this is all what it's building towards, is the culmination of these ideas, and then Takahashi and Sorya-saga's, what they have to say about it.
Okay.
Given through this set of images and music and art that tries to get across their feelings on these principles to us, the audience.
Great.
That's what I think we're building up to. Of course, on top of that, what we already discussed as far as death and clinging on to life versus acceptance and all that stuff about life extension we talked about, all of those things together, I think, are what you could go into this. I'm not going to tell you what to do, but you could go into this playthrough of the game with us with those things in mind, and I feel like you might come out of it understanding the game in a very different light than maybe you have before. Unless you already knew all this coming into this, and this is just a fun recap of all the stuff you already know, in which case, congratulations.
Congrats.
This will be fun to talk about with you guys. I wrote all these freaking quotes down, so I'm going to read them, even if they're out of context.
Okay,
just to reaffirm what we're saying.
This is one of the fun parts about reading the book, which is why I think everyone should read it. Not so much like, there are specific phrases and sentences in that book. It's like reading Proverbs. It's like reading the Tao Te Ching. It's just like pure wisdom in that book.
Yeah.
It's really beautiful.
Lot of good wordplay, which doesn't necessarily translate. If anyone who knows languages if you're not reading it in the original language, like certain wordplay is not going to make sense. Like idioms and things like that don't really translate to another language a lot of times.
Yeah.
So I'm sure I'm still even missing a lot of that.
When I learn German, I'll read it and then I'll tell you.
I do intend someday to learn German, just because in learning Portuguese, I've now become so interested in the other half of what inspired my mother tongue. Yeah. I want to know both sides of that. I'm getting
Swedish
a lot more
is a pretty good start.
of the Latin roots.
Yeah.
Now I want to see more of the Germanic roots too, and just get more of an appreciation from where my first language really came from, how it was created and formed and things like that.
Dope.
But anyway.
I am in full support of this endeavor.
It'll take me forever. I'm far from being fluent in Portuguese still at this point. So, okay, so some more quotes. In a real man, there is a child hidden. It wants to play. Loved that quote.
That's wonderful.
You must be ready to burn yourself in your own flame. How could you rise anew if you have not first become ashes?
Okay, and here's the other thing that I love about this, and I've been biting my tongue on a lot of this. I know Nietzsche did not love Christianity, especially the organized form, the way that it came to him and the way he kind of was taught it. But those are straight up Christian words right there. A lot of his wisdom is Christianity. I think Nietzsche just thinks Christ didn't go far enough. Christ could have done something, and instead he just chose to, he chose to die instead of becoming great in Nietzsche's mind.
Again,
but the wisdom is still there. It's so interesting. Like become as a child, and anyways, sacrifice yourself. Let those parts of you burn away, just like Meister Eckhart says.
This is just something interesting. You just sparked it. I wasn't planning on talking about this, but it's so easy to, and I think again, this is the way Nietzsche is misunderstood in popular culture as being the nihilistic guy, which he wasn't.
Yeah.
Not in the sense that most people understand what nihilism is.
Yeah, and most people will never read Nietzsche, so
no.
There you go.
So I think he's incredibly misunderstood.
Yeah.
And I think he's misunderstood even on this point. Okay, he's anti-Christian,
right? So
therefore he's against
all the teachings
of Christianity, which is absurd.
Right.
Even in many philosophies that I find abhorrent or that I'm very against, there are going to be parts of those that I'm going to agree with.
Totally.
It's almost impossible to find an entire freaking set
that doesn't
of
share
beliefs
any
or
overlap.
values that has no overlap with what I believe in or agree with.
That'd be pretty hard.
That's crazy.
Yeah. But that is one of the more surprising things when you actually read Nietzsche.
Yeah.
And it was something I alluded to, I think, at the beginning of Xenosaga Ep.II, is that Nietzsche was not. He did not hate Jesus. Well, he kind of maybe sort of did, but he didn't he actually agrees with so much of the stuff that is presented in Christianity and in the Bible, and even with Jesus himself.
Yes.
It's just, he's got a different way of looking at it, but a lot of the wisdom is presented in such a similar way, and he's emphasizing things that maybe Christianity had stopped emphasizing, such as become as a little child.
I think the core of it, the real core of his disagreement with Christianity, what it really was about, was that at least in the organizations that carried that to him,
he did not see Christ in them.
They were all about rejection of what they call the natural man, right? That the natural man is sinful or in some way inherently evil.
Yes.
And that all the pleasures of the flesh and the things that we crave or want are things that you should deprive yourself of.
That you should give up.
That you should burn those things away and self-sacrifice or self-flagellate, right? And this he saw as being against nature. He saw it as against what it meant to be a human. He saw it as what I believe it was, a way of dominating and controlling your flock and depriving them of many of the things in life that are so beautiful for the sake of that control.
Read that last quote from Nietzsche again, because I want to hear it again.
Yeah, well, this is what I was going to get into with the fact that it's
because
not.
He is saying do that.
He's not saying by saying that.
Right.
That does not. This is what I'm saying. There's not like this hard cut. Like, okay, if he believes that, then it must also mean that he doesn't believe in self-sacrifice.
Right.
He does believe.
He just thinks
in
you should sacrifice different
self-sacrifice.
things.
Yes.
Yeah.
You must be ready to burn yourself in your own flame. How could you rise anew if you've not first become ashes? So the idea of self-sacrifice, though, that is such a core, central doctrine of Christianity, he doesn't reject that wholesale just because that's Christian and I hate Christians.
Yeah.
Or I hate Christianity, I should say. No, there are in certain ways where that's vital, and that's part of the will to power, and that's part of the pushing through and asserting your will and going through the refiner's fire of life, so to speak, because that's what initiates growth and change in the person, and that takes you towards that ideal, the Ubermensch.
Yeah.
However, he thinks this should be something that a person, this is a personal journey, not something that an organization or a government or someone over you forces you or indoctrinates you into what's the word I'm looking for? This is a very personal thing.
Yes, if you have the will to power.
If you have the will to power.
If you don't have the will to power, then those with the will to power will assert their will over you, and you just got to deal with it, and it's your own fault, right? So the personal journey is only for the chosen few, and for everyone else,
the chosen few who choose it.
Yes, and so I wouldn't say he's against institutions wielding power and oppressing people. I actually think he was quite for that. It's more that you don't want to be one of those people that gets ruled over, and you want to be one of the rulers. That's the way that I would put it. And maybe you probably didn't have quite that reading of him. That's kind of
I also haven't read all of Nietzsche.
That's okay.
I've read Thus Spoke Zarathustra.
He could be pretty anti.
I've read a little bit of The Gay Science now.
Okay,
and I've read Will to Power. But there's a lot of Nietzsche I haven't read.
He wrote
but the sense that I got from Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and from what I understand other people who study Nietzsche believe, is that is his seminal work. That is his magnum opus. That is like where the embodiment, the full embodiment of his core philosophy really shines.
Yeah,
that's where like the real Nietzsche is at.
Sure, yeah,
is in that. If that makes any sense.
That's the book that Ayn Rand would always like carry around with her, and the way Ayn Rand saw herself, or at least early on, was like, I am doing it. I am being the one.
Okay, let's get through some more quotes, and then we'll actually start talking about this game.
Okay, go ahead.
This life, as you now live it, and have lived it, you will have to live once more, and innumerable times more. Every pain, every joy, every thought and sigh, and everything unutterably small or great in your life will have to return to you. That's from The Gay Science. This would probably be translated today as the joyful science, just so people know.
Oh, right. Yeah,
gay meant something real different back then. The eternal hourglass of existence is turned upside down again and again, and you with it, speck of dust. Loved that. That's also from The Gay Science.
And who does the turning?
That's a question I think a lot of people ask. I teach redemption from the eternal flow. The stream flows back into itself. Again, so this is playing on the Heraclitus thing. I teach redemption from the eternal flow. The stream flows back into itself again and again, and you enter the same stream again and again as the same. Marcus Aurelius kept constantly before him the transitory nature of all things, so as not to attach too much importance to them and to remain tranquil in their midst. Conversely, to my mind, it seems that everything is far too valuable to be so fleeting. I seek an eternity for everything. Should the most precious salves and wines be poured into the sea? And my conclusion is that all that has been is eternal. The sea will wash it ashore again. That's from The Will to Power.
Well, what goes around comes around. That's funny.
that everything recurs is the closest approximation of a world of becoming to the world of being. This was the hardest thing for me to wrap my mind around. And this is the thing I think I felt like the least prepared to talk about.
Well, this is a fun one for me, the idea of becoming instead of being, because having read like Ian McGilchrist and having an understanding of things like process theology, which is gaining popularity nowadays, which is that God himself is in a state of becoming. He is not an end, but that he is a being in process, something like that. And that there is some beauty about the idea, just the general idea of the idea of becoming instead of always being.
Yes.
And that things are not, maybe this is a non-deterministic way of viewing the world.
Yes.
Right. And there's some comfort to that.
Okay, so two things. One, to respond to that, this is essentially my main contention with our entire discussion about eternal life and all of that we've been having for a long time. It only remains something worth living or interesting should there always be a becoming process.
Right.
There's never a state of being which you reach and it's like, I got there. And to me, that applies more to the sort of like maybe Christian idea of heaven.
Right.
Where to me, the idea of living eternally in this bliss of never-ending joy and peace sounds actually more like damnation.
Right.
In the literal sense,
literal
like
sense.
a dam where water stops water from flowing.
Yeah,
and
totally.
it's so apt that that we've got the Heraclitus analogy of the stream constantly changing. The man and the water the stream is never the same the second time you step into it.
Unless you dam the water.
Unless you dam the water.
Then it's not a flow anymore.
And then it's the same. And then it's in a state of being instead of in a transitory or a growth state, a becoming state.
Yeah.
So this is where I'm on board with Nietzsche on this idea of becoming. That we have to always, that becoming is almost a state of being. You have to be in a state of becoming in order for life to have purpose.
Yeah, that's funny.
And meaning. You have to constantly be moving, changing, growing, encountering conflicts, overcoming them in order for your life to have meaning in it at all.
Right.
So if the afterlife is the sort of maybe surface level reading of what the Christian heaven is, I would reject that. That would be the boring thing. I kept using the word boring.
Right.
That to me becomes boring at some point. There's got to be a challenge. There's got to be something to learn. There's got to be something to strive for and become, or else you are a being. You are a human being, not a human becoming, which is what Nietzsche told us. That's where meaning comes from.
Becoming. Yeah.
Now, what I struggle with is his idea of eternal recurrence feeling like a contradiction to this becoming principle. To me, eternal recurrence feels like a being.
That's okay. So I see where you're having trouble then, and I do too, I guess. I'm in the same place.
Yes.
Where it's like he has described a universe in which you cannot escape, and it is stagnant and dead.
Yes.
Yet somehow he still is. He talks about changing it, right, or not, right? It's just this is what is. But then why do anything?
Yes. Nietzsche did not see this as a conflict.
Okay.
So I'm gonna put that up front. He's aware of this and did not feel that it was a conflict.
Right.
And maybe Mix can help us in our discussion here to clarify why he saw it that way. That was the part where I was like, I'm just still not really seeing how eternal recurrence in his definition
and
of
Heraclitus
is not describing being, essentially. If there's because there's a fate. There is no real free will in that. You're just going to keep living the exact same freaking thing over and over again. I understand the concept that you have to have the will to power to accept that reality and still push through and be willing to act and do and grow and leave your mark and assert yourself. I get that part of it. But the part I'm not getting is how he considered eternal recurrence to be in congruence with the concept of becoming.
Well, it sounds like Mix is saying that the Zarathustra is a journey to overcoming the eternal recurrence, so that eternal recurrence is something that can be overcome. And that's weird, but I think that might be where you and I are having trouble here. It sounds, based on the definition of of eternal recurrence, it sounds like that is entirely unavoidable. It just seems that way. Like infinite time and finite matter and eternal recurrence and things will happen over and over. Like you cannot get out of that. But Mix is saying that Nietzsche believed that somehow maybe you can get out of that.
What I understand, Mix, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the overcoming of eternal recurrence is in the yes saying, is in getting to that place where, yes, the thought of this is horrible. It's that weight on the chest I described earlier. However, in the Übermensch's, what he called yes stating or yes saying, essentially acceptance, that's how you overcome it. Am I misunderstanding that? Or is that correct? In which case I still am not quite falling on how that's not accepting being instead of becoming.
It can't be.
Yes, that's correct. Okay. So I feel like I understood it, but I still don't understand it.
But how did he reconcile the two?
Reconcile
and really, you could say he didn't see this as a problem, and I get that, but maybe he just ignored the problem.
Or maybe he just hadn't quite had enough time to think it all the way through.
Well, infinite time. But without becoming, the infinite time turns into him never progressing.
Well, here's the other thing. I really struggle with paradoxes. Paradoxes are something that just like, they bug the fetch out of me. And there's a certain level of overcoming a paradox is to accept the paradox.
You always want to overcome them. Yes, that's it.
And that's something I'm trying to do a little bit more in my life, is be more open to that sort of, what is it, the yin side of the yin yang, the feminine or the anima side of it, the nature, the chaos, the paradoxes, the non-rational side of nature is something I need to kind of like ingratiate a little bit more personally.
Okay, then when you say non-rational, now I actually have to bring up a whole nother thing with Thus Spake Zarathustra really quick, because it's also fascinating the way that he says rationality will not save you, right?
Yes.
And he talks about creating your own rules, and yes, religion, down with religion. But if you're just going to, and this is part of why the next 200 years were going to be such a problem, is that once you get rid of religion, now you're going to be ruled by rationality. But guess what? And as Nietzsche predicted, this is true. Rationality has the same pitfalls and shortcomings. It turns into something like utilitarianism. It turns into like, well, you end up being able to rationalize all kinds of atrocities and all sorts of things the exact same way that he would say religion did in the past. And you end up actually, the Übermensch is not, you do not attain Übermensch status through rationality, right? You attain it through being, through like something what Heidegger would call being, like in the, like Dasein, like that type of being, the being that's like, you just feel it and you just are, and you have this will to power that's outside of your little thoughts and your ideas of, oh, I figured it out, I've got it, I figured it out. No, you feel it and you just are it, and you exist in the present, and you just like move forward with that power, right? Instead of, and the rationality he critiqued just as heavily as the religion, or maybe some of the more non-rational parts, even though I think his whole idea of the Übermensch is essentially non-rational, but specifically the religious framework.
Sure.
So it's like there's a trichotomy happening here, and it's the pendulum's going to swing over here, but it actually needs to go outside of 2D space into the z-axis and find its way towards the will to power, which is not on the spectrum of religion versus rationality. It's not on that spectrum. It's a whole different place in z-space.
We're a new dimension.
Yeah, it's a new dimension totally, and it's one of pure being and yeah. Anyways,
what is Mick saying here? Are you keeping track of this? He's
scroll up a bit. I didn't see that. You overcome the eternal recurrence by not pushing for a world outside of it, but by fully embracing and accepting the world of eternal recurrence.
Right.
And you think you don't. And I think you don't attain the Übermensch status too. I know, I'm just saying the word. Okay. I think it's a goal that man sets, right? Because the whole idea is that you're on the bridge. You'll never actually be there.
You're the bridge to the Übermensch, and you're not going to be the Übermensch.
In fact, even when I say that's not the point, once again, there is no point, because point is end. Point is you got there.
Becoming.
There is actually no point. So in a sense, Nietzsche's philosophy is pointless.
There you go. I like that.
And then becoming, never being. All right. And then scroll down. The goal is to create the exemplary human individual, so close to the Übermensch, but the asymptote, you'll never get there.
Yes.
That it justifies human existence and makes man indeed that superior creature on this world without God.
Yeah. That's a great way to put
Thank you, Mix.
It's a great way
Full
to
credit to Mix.
Okay, I'm going to read the rest of these quotes, and we're going to move on.
Yeah, well, I'll try. I'll hold my tongue.
Okay. That everything recurs is the closest approximation to a world of becoming to the world of being. I read that one before. Okay, only two more. Recurrence calls for a yes saying without reservation, even to suffering. We just touched on this. Nothing in existence may be subtracted. Nothing is dispensable. My formula for greatness in a human being is amor fati, love of fate. Love of fate, right?
Yes. Oh, that's it. That's acceptance. Right?
Yes, acceptance.
Not just acceptance. It's falling in love with your own existence, falling in love with your own fate, right? Like that's something he probably had a hard time doing.
The ultimate expression Nietzsche reaches through all of this stuff is love. Like love is the I don't want to say the end. There is no end. There's no becoming.
It's
but it's the means by which you find the yes saying and the acceptance to this sort of horrible at first thought fate of eternal recurrence.
Yeah.
Okay.
I love that because that puts it just a stretch beyond even acceptance, as we've been talking about.
Right.
It's like, no, just
not just accept, but also
it.
love.
Like hug it and like be friends with it.
Love it.
Yeah, love it.
As well. That one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity. One must not merely bear what is necessary, still less conceal it, but love it.
There you go.
And then the last one, the will to power is at its core the instinct to grow, affirm, and express oneself. I actually don't think that's a quote from Nietzsche. That's just me summarizing.
Oh, sick. Well, that was dope.
Okay.
Add it right in the margin.
All right.
So how much of this game are we actually going to get through?
Well, I'm actually starting to think, because I'm not sure how long we've been going here. It's
actually
been an hour and a half. I think we should actually just make that the first episode.
Okay, and then just call it Thus
We'll
Spake
call
Zarathustra.
it episode 0, Thus Spoke Zarathustra.
Also sprach Zarathustra.
This is what you need to understand, I think, to understand Xenosaga episode 3, but also all 3 games as one story.
I love this because I kind of felt I was not disappointed by the first 2 games in the general sense. They're awesome games. I was I felt that I did not get enough of the Nietzschean ideas in there. Like they're there and they reference the words, right? But I wasn't getting the full philosophy. And it's fun to me, given that you've finished the game, feeling like I'm finally going to get something with a little more substantial in episode 3 as this all gets rounded out.
Yes.
That I felt like was maybe missing in the first 2.
Now, in saying that, I also want to set the right expectation for this, and that's not to say that it's not there. It is. It's there. Good. Like you're going to see more of it than you did before, I feel like. But this is a story not made by Friedrich Nietzsche. So this is not a story that just affirms all of Nietzsche's conclusions and beliefs. It's a story that uses Nietzsche as an influence, but that is asserting, Xenosaga and Tetsuya Takahashi's thoughts also in there, and and their influences that come from different places too. So this is not. I don't say this to say that we need to have a Nietzschean mindset, and that the game is going to conclude as Nietzsche would conclude on its themes.
Oh, I see where you're going.
Right? So while I think it's important to understand these concepts, to understand Xenosaga, these are not the conclusions Xenosaga and Tetsuya Takahashi are going to reach at the end.
Okay,
They're going to use it as part of their conflict to make their own conclusions and to assert their own feelings about some of these things.
So Xenosaga 3 is not pointless. It does have a point.
It does have a point.
Perfect.
It does have a point.
We will get there. We will get to the point. And it probably has some morals in it as well. Right?
Yes.
I'm sure.
And like I said earlier, there's very much still that Japanese cultural influence, the strong desire to break fate, to make your own future, which is very against this concept of the yes saying and the acceptance of eternal recurrence that Nietzsche preached. So those two, their culture does not align with Nietzsche on that particular thing.
Would you even maybe say that this game is not meant to be experienced from Nietzsche's point of view, but is meant to be experienced from the Christian point of view? Based on their interviews and stuff, it seems like that's the type of audience that they were expecting to encounter this game. I know Japan.
I don't
know
want to
that,
give
but-
away certain
Okay.
parts of this, and so there's certain things I want to hold off on saying in regards to that.
Okay.
But like generally, yes. And it is interesting that we have both brought up, even in the past few weeks, about certain characters that are villains seeming to be the ones embracing the Nietzschean
philosophy.
stuff,
Yeah.
and the
In fact,
the heroes not so much.
That's almost 100%
Yeah.
in the game. It's like, yeah, they're exploring Nietzschean philosophies, but also all the bad guys are the Nietzschean philosophy people.
Yes.
And at least in part, maybe it's because they're being too rational about it.
Yes, and so I
Which is not Nietzschean.
wanted to have
Go
this conversation to clarify some of the misconceptions of Nietzsche's, the way people see Nietzsche's philosophy. Because I do think, I'm not saying Xenosaga and Tetsuya Takahashi misunderstood it. I'm not saying that.
They probably understand it better than us.
They chose to frame his philosophy in the way they did in this game,
Okay.
and it does at least appear
Cool.
a lot of times that the villains are the ones that are Nietzschean, not the heroes, and maybe that's their statement about it. I'm not asserting their intention there. I'm not.
As Ivan in the chat says, they're like children playing with ideas.
Yes.
How perfect, right?
What
How
I
perfect.
am saying is that they have their own ideas too. And so this game is them expressing, as the creators that Nietzsche encouraged people to be, they are using art to affirm and express themselves. They are not using their art to affirm and express Nietzsche.
Which no one can.
No, and you shouldn't anyways.
No one understood him as much as they thought. Yeah.
No. And so just don't expect them to reach Nietzschean conclusions, but understanding Nietzsche will help you understand the conflict that the characters are confronting
Perfect.
and why they reach the conclusions they reach.
Okay. Well, good.
Does that make sense?
It does, except I haven't played the game, so it doesn't. But I'm expecting it will make sense
I
once
hope it
I
does.
finish the game. And so I think this was a good idea to start it off on this note.
Okay. So that's going to be our episode 0 primer for
Dope.
Xenosaga episode 3. Next week, we're going to be playing, I want to say, all the way up to the aftermath of the Telos Cosmos fight.
Okay.
So there's a big showdown, the first real big high-stakes showdown between Cosmos and Telos. I'd say like that's probably going to be a good place to stop for our first episode discussion. Sound good? All right,
Sounds
everybody.
good to
We'll
me.
see you next week. Peace out.